Hey everybody, welcome to Mr. Kenny's Medieval History class. Today we're going to be looking at the decline of feudalism, which will be our last official lecture for the course that you have. So congratulations to making it to the end. Proud of you guys. I missed you. Can't wait that we get to see each other again. All right, so today we're going to be looking at the various things that ended the feudal period. So first, let's look at the growth of towns. Now, towns were once part of the manor system. They were part of the domain of a feudal lord, meaning the land that was controlled by them. Now, we know that the Crusades started bringing in new wealth to towns. We have an increase of trade, so that's bringing in wealth. We have an increase of professions, people not just being peasants. So towns are going to start getting more and more wealthy, and they didn't like paying taxes to these feudal lords that may or may not even be there. Many of them were gone after the Crusades. Some died, some decided to stay in the Holy Land. So sometimes these taxes were going to people who hadn't been there for generations. Also, another thing is feudalism, remember, started because of the need of protection and order. Order is established, and now they don't need protection. There are no more Viking attacks, Magyars. We don't have the Islamic invasions happening now. The Christians are invading Islamic lands. So they no longer needed that protection in there. So what happened is towns started purchasing something called charters from the king. So this is kind of ingenious. This gives the wealth to the king, and the king basically takes the authority from the noble and takes the wealth, and then the town is able to govern itself. So why are these towns getting wealthy? So one of the things that we have is we have more agricultural improvements. We've gone over that circle of awesome so many times. More food equals more people, which means more technological advantages, which means more food for more people. So less people are having to do the farming to get more food than they would have before. And because they need to have less farmers, that means there can be more merchants, bankers, craftsmen, artisans, all of these things. Now, some towns are really going to go heavily into this and focus on particular goods. We have places like Flanders, which is going to go focus on cloth. Places like Venice are going to focus on glass. Venetian glass is actually still famous. And other towns, they just focused on banking, so just dealing with money. So I always like to go and take a look at a growing medieval town. Normally, what we would do is we would go take the time to see what we notice in this picture. We see the construction here. We see that they're not using wattle and daubs, so they're not going and making their houses out of straw and essentially poop. We see people wearing fine clothes. We see how filthy the river is. Part of it's because they're going and dumping their refuse in there. But look, over here, they're washing their clothes. We see the church right here. We see it's the only stone building, with the exception of the castle in the distance. Um, Here we have, we see the signage because most people couldn't read. We see the animals living there. We see monks. We see people dumping things out their window because, yes, that's what they did. Just so many things going on in this town. All right. So another thing that contributed to the growth of these towns were guilds. Guilds oversaw the production of goods. Now, there's two kinds of, well, there's truly three. There's banking guilds, but really we're worrying today about merchant guilds and craft guilds. Now, guilds are going to set prices. If you wanted to be part of a guild, you had to pay money, a due, to be part of the guild. Much like, so I'm part of the teachers union, and I pay to be part of that union. But what happens is you want to pay that money because you want to be part of this organization. First off, in these guilds, you often were not allowed to practice a craft unless you joined it. So, for example, you couldn't be a cobbler, someone who makes shoes, unless you're part of the cobbler guild of that town. And part of the reason for this requirement is the guild set the standard for quality. Because if you have one cobbler making terrible shoes in Joville, and then might come out, and people might think, oh, well, don't buy your shoes in Joville because there's a bad cobbler, and so you could give a bad name to all the other cobblers. It makes it so that some other person can't come in and undercut the prices so much to drive everyone out of business, and then lower the prices, or excuse me, raise the prices afterwards, much kind of like Walmart has done by going in and they undercut all the prices, remove the other businesses, and then they can raise their prices some. Um, just like how right now. So if I'm sick, super sick, the union will go and allow me to take more sick days and help me, so that I can still take care of my family. Same kind of thing here. Say you're a blacksmith and you wind up maiming your hand, the guild is going to help take care of your family. So think of those dues almost like an insurance too. Now, how do you join a guild? Well, it starts from a young age, just like how we talked about how you become a page at the age of 7 and then a squire at 12 to become a knight. It's the same idea. You start learning very young. So you become an apprentice around age 12. Many times, just like how the page would go live with the knight's family, you might go live with the master's family of the craft. And then after 7 years, you can become a master of your trade. You have to do a master work and then start your own business. Now, this is super expensive. Most people do not have the funds to be able to do this right away because they've essentially been a servant all this time, not really making money. So, what happens usually is you become what's called a journeyman, which means now you work for a master craftsman and you get paid to do it. So, it's kind of like the step, then you build up your money to be able to start your own business. So, that's how that works. And this is actually still a system, with the exception of living with the person starting at 12 today. My cousin is a mason and he, became an apprentice. My father was an electrician. First he was an apprentice, then a journeyman. And if he opened his own business, he would have been a master. So it's still something that exists today. Here's another thing that's going to help end feudalism. Normally, we'd be playing a game where I would be giving some of you the quote unquote plague using bingo chips. It's always a fun one. I'm sorry that we don't get to do it this year. So as towns get bigger, there are going to be more health problems. Now, medieval towns were typically densely populated. If we think back to that picture we saw earlier, we saw how crowded it was. In fact, I'm just going to zoom too far. We see how there are all of these people all up close to each other. The houses, they're right up on each other. There's just so many people. And so, because of that, would be a densely populated area. Many people living in a single spot. So, another problem that we have here is then disposal of wastes. And I'm talking about human waste, pee pee, poo poo, that kind of stuff. We saw in that picture, someone was literally just dumping it out the window. We saw another person just dumping it into the river. And so what happens is this is going to make the spread of disease incredibly fast, incredibly common, and easy. And the most horrific of all of these diseases is going to be the bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death. Now, the bubonic plague is going to come from infected fleas. These fleas are going to be on rats. Now, with how dirty the towns are, what's going to happen is people having fleas is going to be extremely common. Some people in Europe at this time might go months without changing clothes or bathing. So people were extremely dirty compared to our standards today, and actually by most of the world standards at the time. Europe was kind of an anomaly with how dirty people were compared to the rest of the world. But this isn't just going to affect Europe. This is actually going to probably kill about half of China's population, maybe a quarter to 50% of North Africa's population, and roughly a third of Europe's. Depending on where you were in Europe, it could be worse too. For example, the city of London might have lost 2/3 of its people during this time. And so we think the fleas came from rats on trade ships from China. And during this time, actually, the Mongols ruled China. Remember, the Mongols opened up and expanded trade. And we talked about how that was a positive, how we had all of this additional trade and spreading of information and wealth. But with it came these fleas, and we think that they first came to around Crimea, then through the Black Sea, and as these rats came, then the fleas came, and then people got the fleas, and people died by the millions. It was horrible. Hopefully, I'll be able to send to the primary source, the Decameron, which describes the horror of the bubonic plague. Now, what's kind of crazy, though, is even though this was horrific, having all of these people die in the bubonic plague, this actually helped the survivors in some way because now there are less workers, but there's still a big demand for the work. So there are less people to do the jobs, but the jobs still need to be done. And so what that means is if there's a low supply but a high demand, it means higher wages and more rights for the workers. You're able to go and ask for more money because everybody wants you to do the job. So if you go and ask Caden to do the work, and you say, "Well, I'm going to pay you $5 an hour," but then of course we have Avery offering to pay him 10, and then you have Cassie offering to pay 12, and Jaden offering to pay 13. This is really good for Caden because Caden is able to go work where he wants and get a higher wage. Also, he has to be treated better because if Caden isn't being treated well, he can just leave and get another job. So this is going to wind up actually being beneficial for those who survive, even though how horrific it was. Map is just showing kind of the growth. Everyone's like, why was present day Poland essentially unaffected? And that's because it was mostly just forest. It wasn't very densely populated at this time, this big swath of area. So we see the bubonic plague, and the crazy thing with the plague is it was there, it was very bad, and then it was almost like it disappeared, and then it would come back, and then almost disappear. So we have these 5 years listed for the plague, but honestly, there'll be plenty of times where it'll just randomly pop up, flare up, lots of people get sick, and then disappear, just like that. It's kind of crazy about how that goes. Here's the plague doctor. This is a very common image, and the idea was these beaks would be stuffed with herbs because the stench was so horrible from all the people dying. It was just horrendous. And there are some people that believe that maybe the sickness traveled through smells, so that was another idea. But really, like, think about how this would help them, like cover them up so hopefully they don't get the fleas on them to bite them. They've got their, the mask going on to give you the good smell. The bubonic plague, I'm not going to get into the effects it does on the body. I think the Decameron primary source that we like to look at is typically a better way of seeing what the writer themselves said about the ill effects of the bubonic plague. All right, another thing that is going to wind up actually hurting feudalism is a war. We have something called the Hundred Years' War, and it was a war between England and France, and it lasted, a little bit more than 100 years, 1337 to 1453. And the whole war was fought over control of land of France. We have known since our English lecture England lecture, that the kings of England owned parts of France because originally the king of England, when it was William the Conqueror, he used to be a vassal of the King of France. And in the beginning of the war, the English are incredibly successful. They just dominate. And it's because they have a more modern military. The way the English fought was instead of going and having very expensive knights, they had peasants that they were paid, and then they were given the longbow. And I know you might be thinking, well, peasants versus knights, this doesn't seem fair. Well, the longbow is going to be the decisive factor here. The longbow was very cheap, it had a very long range, it was very accurate, and it was extremely deadly. Typically, I show a video clip showing the power of the longbow and how it could pierce through a knight's armor depending on the range. So we're going to have these battles between French knights and English peasants, essentially, like the Battle of Crécy. And the French nobility, those knights, they're going to charge, and they are going to be wiped out by the power of the longbow. They called it the medieval machine gun. Well, now they call it the medieval machine gun because machine guns weren't invented, so they didn't call it that back then. Because they could so quickly load another arrow, shoot, load another, shoot, and it just wiped out the French knights. The French also used crossbows, which are shorter range, slower to load. Now they were powerful, but it just wasn't a competition really. Now, eventually, France is going to get with the picture. They're going to start using a more modern military like the English. And what happens though is because the French are defending their land, France, because of characters like Joan of Arc, we're going to see the French start really becoming patriotic, and they're going to wind up repelling and defeating the English eventually. And there's a couple of reasons why, which we'll get into in a minute. So, just I love this comic right here. Oh, start of the 100 Years. They reckon it'll be over by Christmas, because pretty much every war, they always say, "Oh, it'll be over fast. We'll just win. It will be great. It'll be glorious, and then it'll be done." And then people realize how horrible war truly is. So I mentioned her. Let's talk about Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc is a fantastic story. I wish we were spending more time with her this year because she really is so interesting. She's a 17-year-old peasant girl who believes she hears the voice of God, and God is saying, "You, Joan, will help drive the English out of France." So, of course, this is something else right here. And she goes and winds up going to try to go tell the Dauphin of France that she is receiving this message from God. So she winds up going to this party, and she's never seen the Dauphin before. She doesn't know what he looks like. And actually, what's super interesting is he was there at the party, but incognito, meaning in disguise, and someone else was actually like dressed as him, acting like him, according to the story, pretending to be him. And Joan goes right up to the right guy and then starts telling him that she is called by God to go help drive the English out. She tells him things that only no one else knew, and she winds up going and being given soldiers to because right now the French are losing so bad. It's like, why not? Let's try it out. So the Battle of Orleans, she is actually going to wind up going and leading the French to victory. She's going to be wounded in that battle, but still continue on. Unfortunately for Joan, she's eventually captured by a group called the Burgundians and then sold to England. Now, the Burgundians are going to flip sides a couple times in this war. And when she's went and brought to England, she is actually considered a heretic, someone going against the church. Their main excuse was, she said, "Well, you're hearing voices from God. That's obviously the devil, because God wouldn't be saying, to defeat us." And then secondly, the fact that she wore armor, she wore pants. And they said, "You're dressing like a man. A woman doesn't dress like this." And they tried to make her discredit what she said, to say it wasn't true. And eventually they go and burn her at the stake as a heretic. Now, the French, although Joan is out of the picture, will win the war. And kind of was inevitable. Uh, England had about 4 million people living there. France had 17 million. So simply, a long war like this isn't going to work because France just has more people. Secondly, in the beginning of the war, the English are going and capturing land, which is bringing in wealth. But think about it. You then have to control that land. You have to have soldiers there protecting you. You have to pay for them, feed them, take care of them, arm them. And this is very expensive to do overseas. So holding this land became way too expensive for England to be strong in it. So it eventually bankrupts England. They run out of money trying to do this. And you think about it too, is France is so much larger than England. It was too much land for the tiny Kingdom of England to control. So it just, unless the war was a quick war, which we know it wasn't, England had no chance of actually keeping this victory. And the main effect of this war is to increase the power of kings. Because here's the thing, in the feudal system, the kings needed the nobility to give them knights. We had this whole feudal process where kings gave land for military service. Now the king doesn't need to give land for military service. Now, with tax money, he's able to go have an army of peasants with longbows, which proved more effective than knights on the battlefield. And now let's look at it this way too. Those feudal lords that the peasants used to have, they typically were not very kind to the peasants. Now the king is paying them. This idea of fighting for king and country. So now there's going to be more loyalty of the peasant class to the kings. Another effect that's going to happen is castles stop being effective because during the Hundred Years' War, we start seeing more gunpowder use as well. And let me tell you, as we learned in Constantinople in 1453, cannonball beats wall every time. So we see that one of the ways that the nobles were powerful because they had these fortresses, these castles, no longer do they matter. So the nobility will lose more power. So we see in all of these things that we've discussed, kings are gaining power, they're gaining wealth, and the nobility is losing it. The nobility are losing the towns, the king is gaining money from those towns, giving charters. The kings are gaining a military force independent of the nobility. So this is the decline of the nobility, the decline of feudalism, and the rise of kingdoms. Here's one of those cool maps that go and change over time, showing the evolution. So we see that the gray is England, the yellow is going to be French, and we see how England is going to start and originally conquering territory. They get pushed back, and then we're going to see that it grows and they get more land, and the French start going and regaining, and we see eventually how the French are going to win the war and take all of France for themselves. Okay, here's a comic. You Can't Fire Me. Joan of Arc quits. It's pretty horrible. Sorry. So, what we need to take from this lesson is that kings become the power and the authority of the land. This is when kingdoms become nations. One of the things that I talked about in the Hundred Years' War is the French get an identity of being French, not from being from this area of France, not being, well, I'm from Aquitaine and I'm from this area. No, they become French. And the same thing from England. They become nations. So, and this happens all over the Europe, with the exception of the Holy Roman Empire, which we see kind of explode because it was always really a bunch of principalities together, not a unified. But I mean, let's look at this. Look how many states are in the Iberian Peninsula. So the Iberian Peninsula right here. So Leon, Castile, Navarre, Catalonia, Spain, Portugal. Right now, France, this only shows 3. You could probably separate Aquitaine out there in Burgundy as well. And then we have France. We look at England. We have Wales. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. England, Wales. Oh gosh, what is that one place called? I'm forgetting the name of another place because it's not listed here, but there's another one. And then we just see England and Scotland. All over we see how we have places becoming unified. We look over in the Italian peninsula here, and we see it, our Kingdom of Sicily. All right, so that is going to be our lecture for the day. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. I miss getting to tell all of the stories, and we definitely had to cut some out so that this wouldn't be super duper long. Please like, subscribe, and I hope you have a great day. Miss you all.